All right, so good afternoon, everyone. We have here our friends from Permit.io and led by their co-founder, Weis, and then other technical lead, Oded Ben David, and Gabriel L. Manor, their director of Gabriel. So over to you, everyone. We're going to uh, have a panel discussion for cloud native security tools, enhancing cloud protection capabilities. And so over to you guys.
Thank you. So
Yeah.
it's really a pleasure to be here at the Open Security Summit. We've been here in the past and was always a blast. And as we were introduced, I'm happy to have with me some of my great teammates, Oded and Gabriel. And our topic for today for this panel is cloud native security tools and how you enhance your cloud protection capabilities. And I think this is quite a huge topic to cover, so we probably won't cover all of it in one go, but I think we can start touching on some key points here. And I think I'll kick us off and then we'll roll with the conversation. Also, people in the audience, if you want to ask a question, please utilize the chat capabilities here, and we'll would love to kind of take those into the conversation as well. So first and foremost, I think when we talk about cloud native security, I think we need to talk about cloud native applications and understand where where we're standing there. So we've come a long way from monolith applications running on your laptop or running on a server within a server farm. Now software is distributed. It's built of tiny components that are all interconnected in some way. And all of them are performing critical actions against a constantly growing distributed data plane. So we have more information as part of our applications, more information as part of our organizations, and more information as part of interconnections between companies, customers, partners as well. And another thing that is becoming more commonplace but is still rather new is these software components becoming intelligent. So AI agents, specifically large language models, are more often being embedded into software. And that's also changing dramatically how we view those microservices. So in the past, if we had a small microservice that was running on Lambda, we knew that it's a rather simple component. Now you can't even know that anymore. It can have a lot of sophistication, and it can affect a lot of the area around that. So I think that's kind of where we're at and where this discussion is kind of going to focus. And I want to take it with you folks, you, Gabriel, and you, Oded. Where do you think the main problems are today when we're trying to protect our cloud native applications? Maybe Gabriel, maybe you can
Yeah. So you gave a nice brief introduction. Usually when speaking about cloud native security, so there are the 4 C's: code, which is the application code; container, which is the tiny piece of the application that's running; cluster, which is where we built the architecture; and cloud, which is the runtime that running our applications or architectures. I think that cloud is not a new field in security because the cloud is here for a time. Also, containerized applications or applications that running independently is not that new. I think that where we see the most new trends in cloud native security is code, where most of the software development organizations today are looking in a trend called shift left or DevSecOps, where we are securing the application from the first line of code that we are writing. So we want to make sure that we are proactively secure our application from the small piece of it, like a code; and cluster, which is mean for specific architecture that taking containerized applications and running them together in a cloud agnostic environment. So for example, the most common example is Kubernetes, that you can take Kubernetes and run it on every cloud provider. So you potentially agnostic to the cloud provider you want. And we need to find the new pillar to secure this kind of architectures. So again, in my opinion, the most fascinating thing to think about new tools and new trends is code and clusters, but of course also how we secure the cloud itself, the cloud as a runtime, and containerized or like artifacts of applications.
Yeah, I think you can basically look at it as different perimeters of defense that you have. This also, I think, works well as an analogy to the real world. So you have like a wall around your forts, and you have your guard towers, and then you move closer and closer into the core of your compound. And the more you move in, the more sensitive things are, and the less protection you have in place. I see Denise joining us. Hey, Denise, we were already kicking this off without you.
No, absolutely. Sorry, I was a bit late, so I was just finishing
No worries.
the conference.
So I'll keep rolling with that thought, and then you feel free to kind of join in and navigate the conversation. So as I was saying, you have different levels of defense, and and the deeper you go, the more you move from like the cloud environment, you move into the code. Obviously, the attacker landing there has more ability to affect things and more ability to be more sophisticated. So, and that's also to some degree could be counterintuitive, because you're thinking, oh, if I have someone locked in a container, then I can limit what they do. But because applications are becoming more and more interconnected and they're becoming more sophisticated, they can actually do more damage in the application level. So yeah, maybe their code is limited to running on that within that container, but their effect on talking to other APIs and leveraging the secrets that are available to that code and leapfrogging from there is not actually as limited as you want it to be. So in the past, with non-cloud native applications, I think running something containerized or in a separate VM, that provided a lot of protection. And nowadays, as we move things more and more to the application layer, there's more sensitivity in the code area itself. And that's something that I think not a lot of people have been thinking about. Oded, do you have something to add here?
Yes, I actually want to join to the last point, and said that when we have a lot of applications, that part of your application that talking with each others, it usually you don't think about securing your own application from itself. You're thinking about how to protect it, as you said, to build a wall. But now we are talking a lot more about zero trust. Even inside the application, there are parts that shouldn't get authorized to all the parts of the application. A quick example could be your fronted microservice shouldn't get to your database. He should get access through your backend, or even a dedicated microservice in your backend that only it allows full access to your database. So this, for examples, show us that the new cloud architectures take us to a new way of thinking about authorization.
Yeah, look, I completely agree with that, guys. In fact, I was just you remind me of this little cartoon here, right? Can you show to see my screen? Can you see this? Right? You know, it's from XST, but it's a bit like, hey, look, I got a user account on the laptop. I can access Dropbox, Photos, Facebook, Gmail, PayPal, Bank, but you know, at least you can't install drivers without permission, right? So I think the key of all this is context, right? Like and I do agree that sometimes we go and says, oh, now I'm in the container, it's good. Actually, no, because you know, a bit of code or a vulnerability in the container that has high privileged access to assets can be way more dangerous than full access to a backend system that's, you know, has no data, no assets, no major criticality, right? I think that the key challenge is understand the context and making good security decisions. And a lot of the times what we end up doing across multiple generations of this is we throw the baby with the bathwater. So we go, oh, we don't really understand this. So let's go to the cloud. And then you kind of ditch all those great sysadmins that you had. And then you realize that when you get to the cloud, you do still need those understanding, right? And then you go, oh, let's now containerize this, and you ditch this stuff. Now let's go everything over there. And then there's a set of skills that are critical, like understanding, like role permissions, understanding assets, understanding who accessing what, and that stuff, right? And that has been almost one of those elephants in our industry, especially on security, that we almost need to say we don't understand it, right? There's applications that are there that there's nobody who actually understands how that thing actually works, especially when you look at authentication authorization, right? Especially on role-based stuff. There's so much complexity sometimes that some systems have that is crazy, right? And in a way, the access is not just on an app. Is the app, is what you're running, is almost like the cascading privileges occur across the board on those environments.
Yeah. And I think that really highlights the point that in the end of the day, there's no silver bullet. Like people looking for a silver bullet that say, oh, I'll just take a container, or I'll just take another, and I'll apply it and I'll be done and good. That's not going to happen probably ever. But what you can do, and that's the closest thing you can get to a silver bullet, is design security into your product, into its core at day one, and continuously build that. And I think components that are part of the application itself, primarily authentication and authorization, those can bake in a lot of that security aspects in an inherent fashion into your software, and you can be much more clear and build zero trust connections. So for each microservice specifically what is it allowed to do, and how you manage the policy for it, how it connects to your database, how it connects to other services, how it connects to external services, and you can enforce that across the chain constantly from the code itself. I think that
but I want to challenge you on this one, right? Because I think there's lots of bodies on that road, right? And there's a lot of really good teams and really good technologies on that road. And for a while, we had this security by design, security by default, and security deployment, which is actually really good. Actually, Google's recycling the Microsoft stuff on it, right? But the problem is complexity, right? The problem is there's a moment where, and I'm the first one to say, the better design, the better your architecture, the more visibility you have. But I have to say, up until recently, I couldn't see how what you described eventually works in practice. It would, and I know there's examples that you can do it, and there's sometimes you can game the system because some apps allow that to happen a bit more easily than others. But I think the piece of the puzzle, or one of the pieces of the puzzle that I think we now have the ability to do, is Gen AI brings us the possibility to start to understand context across multiple layers. And that's a game changer, right? Because what it allows us to do is the feedback loops that allows good decisions to occur in the environment that you just described. Because even if you design something really, really well, there's moments where complexity and change hit the real world. And again, business requirements change, etc. And without a real good understanding and without the ability to connect the dots between the people who are making decisions, people who understand it, to the information that is happening, to what's really being deployed and what's really going on, those systems eventually start to move away from that state. And I feel for the first time, look, first way, 3 months ago, 4 months ago, you would say that and I go, cool, let's build a great graph. And I think you guys build variations of this, right? And you can get that with graphs, you can get that with connections, but without the ability to start to applying context and start to have a dialogue and to translate that to all the sorts of different audiences, right? So that you can make good decisions, right? That for me was the piece of the puzzle, because now you can go, and not yet, but we're quite close. You can start to go to understanding code, understanding cloud formation, understanding changes, understanding the impact, understanding the behavior, and have almost a chain of bots that together start to tell you, by the way, you're just connecting the dots. Now, just to wrap up, what I think is that this is going to reward good architecture. This is going to reward good systems, because you're going to get to the point where the analysis is, I don't freaking understand what the hell's going on here. right? And it's too complex, and it's like we can't freaking understand it. To oh no, this is what's happening. This is the changes. This is the risks you're doing. This is the situation where we are now, right? And of course, that model rewards good engineering. That model rewards security by default, and I think provides a feedback loop that was missing, right? So that teams can make great business cases because you can now see the impacts when you don't use those good architectures. Does that make sense? I'm trying to connect the loops here.
I definitely agree on the architecture part and the loop that produces. Like if you understand your software and you approach it the right way with the right fundamentals, you are much better positioned to face attacks when they come and face new threats and challenges and vulnerabilities as they surface up, because you understand what's going on and you have the components in place to address it in a gradual and smart way. I'm not so sure about the first point that you made with AI, like in generative AI. Like, yes, you can now generate more code or have AI.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I want to use Gen AI to understand the codes. I want to use Gen AI to understand the roles, the mappings. So imagine a world where you say a prompt that says, you are a role-based assistant, right? Or you're going to analyze Kubernetes Docker containers, right? Let's say, for example, right? Here's the policies. Here's how they should work. Here's what good look like. Here's what I expect to see. Here's a TCP dump. Here's an output of, a mesh network. Here's the output of what's going on. Here's an analysis of that tool. Now start asking these questions, right? That is what I think will allow us to do, because it allows us to understand the context of what's happening. Even more interestingly, go on.
Sorry.
Yeah.
The problem with it is when you're using Gen AI to generate tests or an image, and you have 4 fingers in that image, it is okay. Or you have few.
Yeah, but just to clarify this, I'm not saying that the Gen AI creates the image. What I'm saying, Gen AI validates the image creation and helps to create the pull requests. Well, that's a bit different, right? It's like, as I'm saying, here's my standard for what my image should look like, right? Here's the stuff of the image, analyze those two and give me an analysis. It's very different. And from the analysis, you can create pull requests. So there's always a human in the loop. What I'm making the human 10x, 100x more efficient to understand what's happening.
I think if you need an AI to explain your system to you, you're already in a dangerous position. First of all, the AI can be helpful, and I'm not against using it, but I don't think it's the right way to go about it. Like if you've created something that is chaotic or messy and it's hard to understand, I think that's the problem in the first place.
But you have that today? Like you guys run on AWS, right?
Sorry?
You run on AWS. For example, what cloud do you run? For example, AWS.
AWS, yes.
Are you telling me that your IAM policies are absolutely matched to a T to the permissions that you guys use?
Yes.
In your application?
Most of the permissions that we enforce aren't in the IAM policies. A lot of them are in the application level, and we do some dog fooding and we use our own policy engine.
But have you list? Get a list, man, of every single permission and every single thing that is allowed. It's really hard to do because it's so complex.
Sometimes it's impossible to do. Sometimes you have recursive aspects.
I know, but it's not impossible. It's just complex, right? The problem is if you take IAM rules, the problem is
it could be mathematically impossible. Like there's the halting problem. If you have something, a system that is complex enough and you have enough connections, then it might take forever to iterate on.
Look again, take IAM rules, right? It's not a very complex problem, right? You have a bunch of permissions to a bunch of assets to a bunch of resources, right? The problem is that the way it's designed, it promotes overprivileging, right? Even if you try to underprivilege. And the reasons why it's very hard to take, here's my role. I want to understand exactly what was the intent of that role. And I want to analyze the usage of that policy. And that's what I'm seeing now that starts to be possible.
So
I think before it was close to impossible.
I think what you're suggesting might be doable, but I think it's a lesser option to building it right in the first place. Like if you know what roles you defined and if you know how you assign them, and if you know that you have tests that you run that check for them every time you change your policy, every time you change your code, then you have a much easier time making sure that you're meeting your own requirements.
I agree, but I look, maybe you guys pull it off, but I have to say that most IAM policies that I've seen, when you go to the details, in fact, I will even take it to another level, right? Your IAM policies, okay, you have one, or do you have 10 or 15 policies in your application?
In the application or in
When you
the
run, when you're AWS environment, do you have one, or do you have 15 dynamic? You have, like, do you give one
have-
policy, or you have several?
we have several, and I'd say
No, but for the same application, for the same container, for the same sort of, execution environment, for example.
So first of all, it depends if we're talking about the infrastructure level. There we try to minimize the amount of policy enforcement, or we're talking about the application level where you have more complexity. And there, I can also talk about customers that we have. There you have policies and rules in the thousands and even tens of thousands.
Yeah, okay, well, like for the infrastructure ones, if you think about it, again, I'm just, playing with devil's advocate here, but like, your application when it runs doesn't need all the privileges that is being given to, right?
Right.
So if you look at the intersection of every single privilege that you have in an IAM policy, right? Just for this example, right? So in principle, you should have lots of policies, right? In fact, your policy should almost change depending on the application is doing.
Right.
But the complexity level of doing that today is too great because we don't fully understand all those permutations.
I think one of the main points that I'm trying to surface here is that if you're trying to do it through the cloud IAM, you're going to have a bad time because it's not meant for that. It's meant for how you connect the building blocks that you have, how you connect the database to your elastic computing, how you connect your lambdas to your buckets. That's the level of sophistication that the IAM policies in AWS were meant to solve. They're not solving for application level roles. They're not solving for quotas and behaviors.
But here's the thing, right? Like if you don't have a solution that addresses that too, right? Where you went to have, let me phrase this. What you're saying is that at that level, you don't have enough context, right?
Mm-hmm.
You need the application to give you context because the application is where the action is, right?
Right.
So by design, you are over provisioning the infrastructure because you don't have enough context. So because by design, you need to have as much privileges as the maximum of what you need once you provide application layer on top.
Right. So you need to, at each level. So first of all, you can improve that by breaking into more microservices, but there's a point where it loses efficiency or efficacy. But yeah, you are right. In the end of the day, there will be things that you won't be able to enforce with the right granularity outside of the application layer. Only in the application layer, you'll have the full context. And then that's why I started with saying with cloud native applications, to actually be secure, you have to go into the code. You have to understand it, and you have to
absolutely
in the first place to enable the level of security that you need. And building your authentication and authorization correctly into your application code is, as time progresses, is becoming the most critical front that you have to protecting it.
I agree, and I'm doubling down on that because I'm saying that my application decisions or my application aware or even user context aware decisions that I'm making need to trickle all the way down, right? Because and if they trickle all the way down across those layers, you get a huge amount of defense in depth because it means that even a blind spot over here on code doesn't cause a huge amount of problem. Because the problem is if you don't take the application specific knowledge that you're just describing from the zero trust, who you are, where you come from, what you want to do, all that knowledge that you can have, and you trickle down to all the roles and policies across your stack, you end up over provisioning. So you almost end up with a pyramid, right, of permissions, right, where the reality is it should be like that. In fact, it should be like this, right? But my point is that Gen AI can help us to solve that problem, because the reason why you don't want to go to IAM policies is because it's a fucking shit show, right? Because you hardly understand what's going on in there, right? And then we limit it to some of the big primitives just because of the level of complexity, but it's still massively overprivileged. right? So if you look at access to S3 buckets, you go, I give S3 bucket access to this part, but actually the user only needs access to that little bit over there, right? Why does he have access to the whole bucket? Why does he have access to all of Kubernetes, right? So I think that, the stuff you guys do is great, because I think we need to push that down, but also we need to start explaining the intent of the rules, and we need to start explaining reality in a language that makes sense to the multiple operators, all the way to the business owners. In fact, all the way
I
to the
agree with
users.
that. I agree with that, but I think we shouldn't trust or expect AI to do it for us. I think as engineers and as security practitioners, we should put in the effort to design those understandings into what we're building in the first place.
Yes,
and
but
if we
it's
rely
like,
on
like
AI,
Jarvis.
we're gonna have a bad time.
No, but again, I'm not saying that you let AI build the whole thing. This is like Jarvis, right? It's like a co-pilot. It's like the ability to have augmented reality understanding,
Yeah.
right?
This reminds me a lot about the talks between developers about clean code against documenting the code.
Yeah.
You can take a really complex code and document it really good, or ask AI to document it for you. And then you probably understand 90% of what this code is doing.
Uh-huh.
This is one way to work. It works. AI know how to explain code. It may mistake a bit for 10%. Those 10% may be really critical, but mostly it will know what this code gonna do. The other way to do it, and I think that we at Permit pushing to this way, is like clean code. Let's do clean
With no documentation.
A little bit. When the code explains itself, when the permissions and the policy explain itself, you don't get into the IAM shit show and you need Jarvis to explain it to you. You can write it in a way that it will be so understandable. You don't want the AI. You just read it and you understand it.
Okay.
For example,
Yeah.
if you take you said you have a lot of machines, you need to get access only to one machine.
Mhm.
So you can do, if you are using RBAC, it is very difficult because you need to have a lot of rules for each and every machines, and it's very complex. But if you are using RBAC or ABAC, you can have a new attribute. This is my machine.
Mhm.
You have access only to it because you created it,
Yeah.
because the admin gave you permission to this machine. And then it's really simple. You don't need AI, you don't need Jarvis. You just read your permissions, you know what you get.
So here's the interesting thing, right? And look, this is the same thing with Agile, right? No documentation, right? So let me ask the question here. If you had clean code and I gave you really good documentation, really good architecture diagrams, I will give you visual representations of what that code is doing, right? In fact, I will give you a visual representation of what that code is doing, plus the code that he calls, and he calls it. Would you want it?
It can be nice.
No, that's a simple question. Would you like it or you would not like it? Would you add value or not add value to have that?
It depends on what your current situation is. If you already have those things, you don't need more of them. It's
No, I'm
like,
saying you don't. I'm saying you have clean code. You have a really nice architecture code that is, you can argue that is easy to understand, right?
Yeah,
And-
for the big picture, a diagram is always nice.
But even about that function, right? Like that function. See, the
About
thing
that function, as a developer, I want to see for myself. If it's a function, a small piece, and it's clean, and I would love to see for myself. This is me.
But that
as a
function doesn't
developer,
work
a
in
security
isolation,
person.
right? That function is called by other functions, is integrated as a flow here, right?
Yeah, so for
And-
the big picture, give me what you have. For the
Yeah.
small picture, as a security person, I want to see for myself.
Sure. But and so my point here is that the reason why you're rationalizing that you don't need or you don't want the documentation, the architecture diagram, right? Is because at the moment it's really hard to do, it's really hard to maintain, it's really hard to keep in sync, it's really hard to version control. It actually takes away from a lot of the work you do, right? But I'll give you an example. Like when from a security point of view, when we do code reviews, right? So you guys ship code, right? You know, let's say you release, 10 times a day, 5 times a day, whatever number that
Every
is,
5
right?
minutes.
Every 5 minutes, right? Amazing, right? Pretty cool, right? By the way, it's not practical to have a security person review every line of code that you ship.
Correct.
Right? It's not practical, right? Unless you have one-to-one developers to security,
not
which is not going to
practical.
happen, right? Not practical, right?
That's the
So-
developer is the security person.
Exactly right. Developers, security person, right? Basically, so how do you know which ones to look at?
So I think here it's maybe, I don't want to make this into a permit pitch, but I think it'd be worthwhile to give a little bit more color about what we do. So with permit, we're providing you a couple of things. First of all, we're providing policy as code. So you don't work with arbitrary code that you write. You work with dedicated policy engines, with languages that are meant, like Rego for OPA and Cedar for AWS Cedar. So you manage your policies in code in ways that are also easy to manage and easy to test and benchmark. So first of all, you don't have to have a security person go about checking all that code, because you can have tests that check that code when it changes, and you can have tests that check the application against that code when the application changes. And then we take it another step up and we provide low code, no code interfaces. So when you write policy as code with us, you don't need to write it as code directly. You use simplified interfaces. Think about a table with checkboxes for permissions. Think about connecting points to describe relationships. So these are really simple interfaces that I like to say a monkey can use, or even a product manager if they're smart enough. Ironically, by the way, product managers are the ones that like that joke the most. And so in the end of the day, when you look at the interfaces themselves, they're so simple that everyone around the team can use them, and they become part of the documentation. So you have the code itself that's maintained in Git, and that's your single source of truth. But you have simplified interfaces on top that make the conversation easier, make the investigating, exploring easier. And we think that in the end of the day, there are 2 points here. A, you have to go into the code if you want to have any protection. And B, you need to work with the right tools and the right abstractions, so it'd be simple for everyone around the table to work with this. And I'm not saying that AI can't come into the mix. It definitely can, but I wouldn't go so fast to rely on it completely.
But I never said that. It's interesting.
Okay.
You jump to an extreme, right? I'm not saying that we're going to let AI write the code, write the policies.
You sure you're not saying that? Because that's a great debate.
No. Well, I think that's wrong, right? Like that's never going to work, because when we don't allow that anywhere. Like, we don't allow a super genius engineer to have uncontrolled access to production just because he can. In fact, we now know that backfires, because although the person can do certain things, like I'm, in a way, Oded, right? I'm a massive fan of clean code, right? In fact, I'm a massive fan of code that you can argue is redundant, but is easy to read, easy to understand, easy to process. So I would always prefer to have code that might be more verbose, but is actually simpler to maintain, simpler to do than code that is freaking crazy optimized. Like if you ever do some stuff in Scala, right? You can write shit in Scala that's like, what the hell is going on here, right? Even the guys, Perl, okay, but I think the readability and understanding of code is very important. Look, what I really like about what you guys did in Permit.io is that you're raising the bar, right? Like you basically bring a whole level of abstractions. And in fact, what you're doing is really cool, is that you are starting to allow the role base to be maintained by the people who understands the intent of the application, right? So you allow the business owner to start to own almost the role base and the stuff that's happening in there, right? Which I think it's really powerful, right? My key points here is that, but even that is still a big layer of abstraction, right? There's still a layer of analysis that you need to put on top of it. You make it easier. So the reality is that any system that uses equivalent of technology that you guys are building is always going to be easier to analyze, easy to process, easier to do, versus a system that authorization is sprinkled throughout the whole thing and is a massive mess to understand.
Yes. Usually what I like about it, that usually when you make things more secure, it's harder to maintain. Because security adds guidelines and walls that prevent you doing things that are not secure enough. And in Permit, we are trying to do it simpler and more secure in the same.
Yeah, and adding business value, right? And that's something you guys need to run with. Like, that's how I position security as a CISO. I said, the things that we want to do in security is to allow the business to go faster, right? Is to allow the business to be more optimized. So it's almost like security becomes an enabler. So you don't have this complexity, right? You basically now have these building blocks, which I think, going back to the point here, cloud native security tools, right? Like, that has a big advantage, right? In that model.
I want to get to a point. You said, I don't want a junior developer get uncontrolled access to production. I think one of the point that cloud native enlight is, what does that mean, uncontrolled access to production? Because non-developers should have direct access to our cloud environment. It's irrelevant for them in cloud native. They should have access to deploy code maybe, but they should never get access to S3 bucket, right? This bucket's supposed to have chained access from the application level permissions, right? So if we are keeping the pillar separately to each other, every function can make sure that they are securing what they need to secure.
No, okay, but here's a question. Can that developer write code that then access the S3 bucket directly?
They can.
They can,
Of course
right?
they can.
They can.
But yeah,
But why should that, but how do you prevent that from happening?
Because in cloud native environments, usually all the deployment part, all the chain that taking this code from repository to the cloud environment is something that controlled not by developer.
Okay, but when the code arrives there, can I, if I'm the developer, can I write code that gets nicely deployed, and when gives the final container, access the S3 buckets directly?
That's exactly, exactly. So that's the point of separation of concern in this pillar of security, right? So developer is writing code. The code specifically that getting access or accessing S3 bucket is secure, right? It's secure if it's fit with the application level security, which again, in a good word, is something that's controlled by a function that's responsible for that.
So that code is going to run in a Lambda function. I was going to run in a container.
Just a second. Now, so we are securing the pillar of the code. We know that the code that are trying to get access to an S3 bucket is code that is safe. We check that with, let's say, static analysis security, maybe even with some infrastructure as code analysis, right? So for example, tools like Kix and Chekhov can tell us, hey, here is an infrastructure that not looks good. And then you as a CISO do not need to have code review on all the code. You can have a code review where is sensitive as a CISO. So in that example, the infrastructure as code, right? So we're securing the first pillar, the code. Then we are going to the container. The container itself, the container as a container, again, does not have access to the S3 bucket. The configuration of this container as an access of S3 bucket. And again, this is something that you know where you are securing. This level of separation of concern, when you are getting to the cloud environment, you only need to take a look on the previous section, of configuration. And in the cloud native way, where everything is declarative, you always have an insight who has an access in the point that is relevant to you as a CISO. Right? And if you need to do some code review for the developer, potentially, hypothetically, right? With the cloud native helpful of everything being declarative, everything declared as code, you know where to open the incident.
But if you go back to when I joined, you guys were talking about the fact that one of the things you need to protect is the fact that the container itself might have access to a lot of resources.
Exactly. And this is exactly the trends in cloud native. So for example, I want to take a look on the trend, the eBPF. Have you heard on eBPF?
No.
So eBPF is a tool that is very trending in cloud native now.
That's like, you've probably heard of iSolvent and some other companies that are using that for service mesh and other level of cloud native introspection into software.
How do you spell it? eBPF?
eBPF.
Okay.
extended Berkeley packet filters.
Oh, yeah. I think I've heard that. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
I know that. Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
BPF, yeah.
So if you think about traditional application, they were mixing or complexing the way you as a CISO can get an access on permissions on things that happened. The cloud native way is helping you to separate what you need to inspect, what you need to analyze, the incident you need to open for the very relevant concern that you have now, right? So you don't have to worry anymore on all your runtime security or on the kernel that you are running on. You can make sure that everything is secure there. You don't have to worry about it because the version is secure. And then you have to worry on the piece of code that have this most sensitive part of what you need to do. Right, and that, in my opinion, this is the way that CISO should start look at the cloud native way with new eyes, with eyes that helping developers use cloud native to help them. If CISO, if security engineers will continue to look on software as a one monolith piece with one backlog of endless findings or endless incidents or endless areas to inspect, they will lose the benefits of cloud native software.
Yeah. But by the way, just a very important point, right? Like I think everything you're describing there, if it's the security team that is driving that, it's already a losing battle, right? Like everything you talk about there from going, that cloud native journey is a journey that the dev teams have to do. We have to support them from a security point of view, but it's not a security team that is going to do that, because it's the dev teams that need to do that. And this is why sometimes I'll argue with some of my peers that say, if you don't have a good CI pipeline, for example, if your engineer team is not doing that, then don't fund tools, fund that. Help them. If you have budget, help them to build proper pipelines, help them to go proper cloud native, because that's the hard part. Securing it becomes, it's almost like these are tools for developers, right? These are tools for them. We're making their lives easier, right? And
I think a next step there, maybe to also kind of simplify the things that Gabriel said. So the idea is that as a security, as a team, as a CISO, you want to enable and empower your developers.
Exactly.
You want to encourage them to work with security, and you don't want to slow them down. And you then then you enable security to plug in via the right tools and by applying decoupling. So for example, if a developer is now setting enforcement into their code, into their app, so they'll use policy as code, and they'll have enforcement points in their code that will check if, for example, that application can talk to that S3 bucket, for example, the example we used before. Can that application in this context and in behalf of this user, is it allowed to go to that S3 bucket? And initially, you let the developers set the policies themselves.
Yeah.
So what the developer is responsible for is setting the enforcement and connecting it to the correct tools and mechanisms. Once those are in place, the security team can come in with their own interfaces and say, oh, this is the policy we've been using so far. It's not good enough. I want to add more rules, more limitations, more capabilities on top.
You're missing
without asking the developer to change anything.
Yeah, but the thing about this is you actually are so close. This is where I'm going to nudge the Gen AI. You're so close, because the real decision has to be done by the product people, by the business people, right? Because that's the key. And what you have is now, this is what I'm saying, that the power of the Gen AI is that allows you to translate all these layers, right, based on reality to the wide audiences. Because the thing you described, in a weird way, it's not what the developer wants or cares. It's not what the technical manager, is doing. Is what the business owner, who owns the project, who owns the risk, who owns the development, right? In a way, they're the person who controls the pipeline. They control the roadmap. They are the ones that, in fact, I'm trying to intersect my worlds now. So, for example, you need to bring now the risk analysis and say, hey, if in this development environment you have this policy and you do this, you do this, you do this, you have these risks, and you're going to have to accept these risks. And it's when we can give the business risks to the business owners that things change, right? And in a weird way, you guys have made such a great stride there, because you're now starting to describe roles and permissions as business functions, right? Which is really freaking cool, right? And I bet that some of your customers are actually on the tech teams, are actually the business teams, because they're the ones who get lots of benefit from it, which is the big challenge I always give to security tools, because I say, if the only people buying your tool are the security guys, then you're already missing a chunk of the market. But the thing now is to connect that with the risk, right? Because if you really want to, and this is where, going back to the cloud native, right? The risk profiles of running stuff in cloud native environments with good designs, with good architectures, with good mappings is very different from the risk profile of running on an EC2 instance that needs to be maintained, or something in your data center, or a Lambda function, or XYZ, XYZ over there, right? That connection is really, really interesting, because we finally have the ability to make the business owners, and here's the interesting thing, the ability to make the clients aware of it. See, what I don't like as a buyer is I don't have access to that data from the tools that my, let's say, my stakeholders, right, which is the whole freaking business, right, are buying. And I want to start pushing those standards down. So I want to, in a way, I want to reward the market that does a good job versus the market that doesn't do a good job. I want to if we're doing an evaluation over there of the business of 3 companies, I would love if the company that does good role-based security has a really good grip on their permissions and roles, we should be able to reward that company with a sell versus the company who's not doing anything, but from a marketing, it looks great. It might even be ISO compliant and have every freaking compliance in the book, but it's not actually doing it properly. So if you guys can go that extra mile up, and then start connect with the owners, the problem you have is the message is different almost every time, because the message is now context specific. And that's the bit that in the past didn't scale.
I think go ahead, Gabriel.
I think that at the end, although as developers we want to develop for fun and develop software for software, at the end we need to do business, right?
Of course.
We develop software for business, and the more we can closer to deliver business value faster, we're getting better software, right? And I think that's one of the main points that drive the cloud native trends. We can deliver software much faster. We can deliver it because we separate the concern of infrastructure and code. We can deliver it because we declare everything and deploying it in second. We can, and all that, we just make all the functions closer. That's our main goal.
Do you still see clients that, question that?
We see a lot of people that don't necessarily understand that fully. Most people are still, and most companies are still struggling just to do the basics.
But then you have bigger problems, right? Like then it's like they're not even ready to talk about, role-based security, because they can't even, connect the dots, right? Like
when they come to us, they're ready to talk about role-based, because that's often what, or
exactly, right?
That's why they come to us.
And by then they surely they are on a path to understanding cloud native, right? Because one maturity surely leads the other.
So I think as there are different roles around the space here. So I think what we need to specialize. We need developers to focus on building good software and meeting the standards that are required by them. We need the security people to be able to set the policies, set the workflow, and connect it to the business. We need to enable the business folks to communicate what they actually need. And we need to enable companies as a whole to be able to adopt these concepts without having to learn too much. And that means that we also need to simplify things. And so maybe AI can help them simplify things, but I think better is tools that have simplification baked into them. If the person himself working with the tool can understand, then he can use the AI, but he won't be dependent on it. And he'll be able to do more things than just that little thing that the AI is doing for him.
Man, here's the thing. That word you said is one of the most important words, simplify. In fact, you should put down a homepage of your website. Because there's a great vision that a friend of mine has, and he says, in security, our job is to simplify the business. And I completely agree with him. When we do security right, we make the business simple, we make it efficient, and I think that's a great property. And yes, going to cloud native simplifies things, right? At the end of the day, because it removes complexity. Although that said, if you have no idea what you're doing, you're going to make it more complex, but then you have different problems, right? But I think that word simplify is very important, right? Because I think that's where you add real business value. The interesting question is measure that, but I think you guys should run with that.
Suddenly, it made me think, or do you want to finish this point? I have some.
No, you can take it. Just we have just a couple of minutes left, and some people sent me.
Yeah, there's a question from
sent me
Kieran.
questions.
Kieran, I made you a co-host if you want to ask that question, because that's quite a cool question.
Yeah, it was around the bit with regards to, when you were saying around ensuring that from a developer point of view that you're baking in that, that you build it, you own it kind of concept, that agile methodology. So it was kind of almost agreeing what what was Dinis was saying around it, to say, like, how do you enforce that? How do you enable that to make sure that that cultural shift actually happens and the developers do own it?
Yeah, so I think in the end of the day, it's separation of responsibilities, and it's about enabling one another. And you want your developers to be able to focus on being good developers. And if you have the ability to plug in the security capabilities either baked into their work or as things that you can connect later in a decoupled way, then that shift motion happens more easily. If you go to your developers and tell them, oh, you need to manage everything, you need to bake all of the security, then some of them would take you up on that and do it. But for most of them, it will be a lot of friction. It's really hard to telescope and cover both areas at the same time. Like a developer at the end of the day needs to be able to zoom into their code, really get into the zone and build it right. And it's hard for them to think about all of the macro things that happen. But if you tell them, oh, this is how you connect to the macro picture. When you're doing, for example, with what we do, when you're building permissions, don't put the policy into the code. Don't have anything regarding that there. Just set points where you're describing what's happening and connect that to another service that will bring in the policy. Suddenly, the developer has the ability to cognitively contain this. They say, oh, I know I want to build this something secure, so I'll make sure I'll set all the enforcement points correctly and fill them with all the context that they need. But they don't need to start extending their mind and thinking about the macro picture of what all the different policies may be that will be applied to this application later. That's something that will be impossible. So by simplifying it for both sides, like making it focused enough for the developers, making it approachable enough for the CISO suite and for the other and the business holders, we can have everyone chime in together and build this without slowing down each other. But it really starts by understanding the focus point for each one on the team and how we connect these things right with in the right way with the best practices.
Oded, I think you're gonna say something, or?
No, I can see that we are almost done.
I can go a couple of minutes more if you guys could. The only thing I would say on Kieran, and just to Or's point, I think it's very important to understand who's making what decision, because I sometimes think in these conversations we talk about the developer as an abstraction concept, and the developers have very little power in most places, right? The developers are executing on a roadmap, so you need to understand who is providing the technical leadership. Because, for example, even or when you're saying, if you go to develop and you say that, they go, of course, I would love to be able to, manage my permissions in this way. But he needs to be given that brief. It's a non-functional requirement a lot of the times. That needs to be in a roadmap. For that to be in a roadmap, that needs to be mapped to the business person. Now, sometimes whoever controls the roadmap has enough power to push it through. But I think in this case, we need to find who is the person that's making those decisions. Who's making the technical decision and who's making the business decision, because those are the ones that will drive it. The person making the technical decision is the one who need to say, the way we do permissions is ridiculous. We need something that scales. Here's a model. Here's a pattern. Go evaluate it. Figure out the best one to do it. And by the way, I'm giving you time to do that. And the person making the business decision need to go, yes, I support that. Because without that, right, the developer won't have the time. Right. And that's why sometimes it happens, right? And my point is that I want to start to influence those developers to have the time by being able to reward the companies who are doing it right, Because a lot of the times that business person is connected to somebody who says, do the clients care? Do the clients understand? Are we losing sales? Are we losing market share? Are we delivering what we need for our stakeholders? So you need to influence that, right? So that, the developer is giving the time to basically then implement those solutions.
I definitely agree. I think you can create a virtuous cycle from that. Once
Absolutely.
developers are empowered, they'll empower back the security and
Exactly.
vice versa. And that's why we actually started, when we started, was talking about the different levels, the different zones of protection that you have, and why you need to care about the code, especially in cloud native. And if you do that, that means that you care about your developers and empowering them.
So I want to give you one more idea before we finish. One of the things that we start to talk about, and there's a great podcast I heard recently where Gary McGraw was saying that one of the biggest challenges that we have is we need to scale threat modeling, and I couldn't agree more. And I think you guys and this world that we talk about can play a big part of it, because at the moment when we do threat models, people go, let me design the system, right? See, that's the problem, Oded, right? Like, it's so nice having no diagrams in your clean code, but if I want to do a threat modeling system, I need to understand how it works, right? I think you guys are sitting on something because you start to have an understanding of how the app works, how it behaves. So I think, you can be a key piece of the puzzle in the ability to scale threat modeling. And threat modeling is one of those practices that, we won the battle. Right? Like, that nobody will argue that threat modeling is not healthy, threat modeling should not be done. The problem is how to do it at scale. How to do it in a way that scales, is consistent, that we leverage, that we don't require everybody in the team to be a security expert, right? Because that doesn't scale. And role-based security, by the way, is where threat model tends to fail, because by then we can't really understand a lot of the things, right? So a clean role-based environment is what allows you to then start understanding the threats of the system and ask really good questions and understand the side effects and then put countermeasures. So I think threat modeling is definitely an area that, going back just to the cloud native, right? Like, the threat model of a cloud native application looks very different than the threat model of a non-cloud native application, right? So the threats are different, the things are different, etc. So yeah, just dropping the idea to you guys, because I think you're going to see a lot of innovation in that world in the next 6 months to a year.
Yeah, for sure. It's actually, some of this is our features that we're already working on. So as part of our audit log system, so one of the cool things about our product is we generate audit logs automatically.
Yeah, fucking gold, right?
And we also have the ability to, in an anonymized way, to understand the behavior of each of the users through those audit logs. So you can generate behavioral analytics and anomaly detection and other capabilities. These are already things that we're looking to bring.
And you know who's going to pay for that? The business guys.
For sure.
That's
and who's going to enjoy it? The developer guys, and who's going to
the security. But here's the sweet spot, right? So one of the things I say a lot these days is that the security team is one of the few teams sometimes that can make this happen, because we sometimes the only ones in the intersection. The sweet spot for security is to find these added values, so you can drive decisions and you can get people on the table that otherwise maybe wouldn't be on the same table, because it's almost like one of those, a lot of the players would like it, but they don't feel the pain or they don't see how it could be done. Where from a security point of view, we can see the path, right? The key is to have those benefits, to say, look, if I do this and I get the security that I need because that's my mandate, the developers get a much better life, the business analysts get a better way, and we're able to give these business insights to these dudes over there, which, by the way, are usually the ones that have a lot of budget, because they tend to be very connected to the outside world, i.e. the places where the business generates value, right? So and again, that's where I think Gen AI will collect a lot of those dots that in the past were very hard to scale, again, at an organization. Cool. All right, guys, any final thoughts or comments on this session?
Not for me. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think we delved into some really interesting points and things that are relevant now and will become also even more relevant down the road. And I thank you for inviting me.
Cool. All right, guys. All right, one ask for you guys is, like, we now have done a couple of these. One of my frustrations is that the Open Security Summit has such an amazing set of content for some of these things. And for example, some of the sessions you guys done also are like a masterclass, for example, of how to think about this. we need to find a way to package that up. I need to find a way that sometimes I can go to an engineer or a business analyst or somebody from my team or somebody from other part of the business and say, look, just go there and read that and see that. The question is, how do we package it up, right? In a nice roadmap. So let's see how we can collaborate on that.
For sure.
Because I think the space you guys in is very important, right? It's a key way to scale security.
Yeah, by the way, Dinis, we just released 2 blog posts that is result from our last conversation.
Oh, cool.
About placing. Yeah, I'll send you the link.
Yeah, tag me on LinkedIn, man. Like, my inbox, just for the record, is a shit show. So like, tag me on LinkedIn at least. I can sometimes.
It's where you manage your policy.
Exactly. I need a bot. I need a bot for that. Brilliant, guys. Good stuff.
Absolutely.
I'll see you in the next one.
Thank you.